What's the best I told you so moment? Story 1. Working at a tire shop, customer bring in a Land Rover Range Rover with air suspension for a set of tires. I watch the tire changers start to set their little scissor lift under the frame to pick it up, and I go over and stop them. I tell them that they should take it down to the second drive-on rack and use the swing jacks under the axles, or else they're going to blow out the suspension. The assistant manager overhears this and comes out into the shop saying that, "I just called Land Rover and they said that to turn off the air ride, all you have to do is open the rear hatch and turn the hazard lights on. Just pick it up where it is and get on with it. The customer's waiting." At that point I said, "Well, you heard the man. I'm going to go back down by my toolbox. Holler if you need me." About a minute and a half later, what sounds like a shotgun blast is heard throughout the shop. They lifted the truck by the frame and blew out all 4 suspension airbags, just like I said would happen. They eventually wound up putting it on the drive-on lift and using the swing jacks, just like I told them to do. Then the customer got to drive all the way from Manassas, VA to Alexandria, VA on the bump stops where the shop I was working for paid $6,000 for a set of used suspension airbags to be installed. God forbid the guy who's actually worked on Land Rovers before might know what he's talking about. Even if I had only been at that particular shop for 3 days. At least they started listening to me when I told them stuff. Story 2. I was in freight. I delivered a pallet that was supposed to have 750 pieces. It looked a little short, so I asked the customer to count it. He refused 3 times after I explained to him if it was short, they're going to deny your claim. He said, "Don't worry." I said okay and noted it on the paperwork that he refused to count. He signed it. 2 weeks later, he called the customer service rep to report a shortage and make a claim. The customer service rep called me and asked did I remember it. I said, "Yep, read the notes." She said, "Oh, he refused to count it. Claim denied, thanks, bye." Story 3. Ex-boss, who I was not fond of, had a vehicle he wanted to sell. He met someone who wanted to make payments on it, used private party, but take possession when they made the first payment. I told him not to do it. I said it was almost certain they will crash the car and then just stop paying, and he'll be left with a damaged car and no money. He told me I was dumb and went ahead with the deal. Okay, whatever you say. For a couple months, things were good, and he was pretty smug. Then he comes in one day and tells me to research what happens if the above scenario happens, and the car was in a tow yard collecting fees. He wanted to know if he was responsible for the fees. I didn't even look up. Yep, if you want the car back, you are. Story 4. My roommate at the time always refused to take his keys whenever he left the house, despite me telling him not to do that, relying on the fact that I always had mine. Our shifts ended around the same time, so we would usually come home together. One day, whilst we were both out, I had to go back to my parents' house, which was a couple hours away. As I was pulling up to their drive, I get a call from him, stranded in the rain, outside our place without his keys. I told him that I wouldn't be returning until tomorrow and that there was nothing I could do. He ended up staying over at one of our friends' houses, but since then he's never left the house without his keys. Story 5. In the late 80s, I worked for my mill as a regional manager of her business. I worked very long hours for $500/WK. At some point, I told her that I deserved a raise. She asked me how much I thought that I deserved, and I replied that she couldn't replace me for less than $1,000/WK. She responded that she was sure that she could, so I said, "Fine, show me." She had trouble finding someone and finally had to pay the $1,000, but after 2 weeks, he was totally incapable of doing what I did, so she had to split it into 2 regions and hire a second guy at $1,000/WK. After 6 months, she discovered that they teamed up to embezzle about $15,000. Of course, she never acknowledged to anyone, especially not me, that I was right and she fucked up badly. Story 6. As a teacher, telling the head principal at my school that the way they were abusing the alternate assessment program to boost standardized test scores was not just a huge burden on teachers, but also illegal and likely to attract the scrutiny of the State Department of Education. He handed me a shitty assignment for the next year. I quit, and he ended up having to take that assignment, teaching 16 kids with emotional disorders across 3 grade levels in one classroom. For the first month and a half of the school year BC, they couldn't find anybody to take my place. I heard later that year that they came down hard on him for the scheme he'd concocted and ended up shutting down the alternative assessment program altogether. Told you so, DL. Story 7. When I was waitressing in college, I got seated a man and a woman together for lunch. When I asked what they wanted to drink, the woman put down the drink menu, sighed, and said just a water. The man ignored me and said something like, "And another thing, complaining about something loudly. He was switching from English into Spanish and back, and I just zoned out for about 30 seconds until I asked if I should give them a minute to decide. Dude turns to me like he's just seeing me. I was 21, with a tanning bed tan and color in blonde hair. I also worked a double the day before. He smirks and says to the woman, "This is what I'm talking about. Look at her. I bet she doesn't know one question off the test and she was born here. Why should I learn it?" The woman apologizes and explains they just come from taking the U.S. naturalization test and they would both have waters. I grab their waters and they are still arguing when I come back. I set the drinks down and turn to walk away when the man says, "Hold on." To his friend, he says, "No, I want to prove a point." He then turns to me and asks, "Do you think you could pass the test to be a naturalized U.S. citizen?" I said probably, but I know that I'd love to take their order for them. Guy wasn't happy. Anyway, I get it. Tests are annoying, but he's wired into it by now and finally stands up upset and says, "Fine, say the preamble to the Constitution." Fellow Americans who had an insane social studies teacher in 8th grade who made you memorize the preamble to pass their class, stressed about it and thought they'd never make it to high school, this one is for you. I hadn't thought of the preamble since then, probably. But baby, my public school, middle school, 8th grade teacher was right. Y'all, I would need to know this important information later in life. It was my time to shine. I preamble the absolute shit out of that preamble. The preamble was preambling. Didn't even have to Schoolhouse Rock sing it. It was like those 52 words were now a part of my DNA. I also stood up straight and stared off at attention to nothing, which I'm sure added to this pinnacle of my college career. The woman clapped when I was done. The man sat down hard and turned away from me. I then looked back at them and said, "Now, can I please take your order?" It was perfect. A bald eagle landed on my shoulder. Uncle Sam cried, "Okay, no." But the woman said screw it and ordered beer and pizza while he sat angry and silent. I got $1.20 tip and the privilege of sharing this important information learned in school. Also on par with, but not quite as important as mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. It was a good day. Story 8. I was a contractor managing stormwater ponds. Happy to field questions on the topic. Cattails are usually bad because they grow so aggressively they'll clog inflow-outflow pipes and take up the flood storage volume. Also often are a monoculture with little ecological value. I had a manager I supervised who kept saying, "We don't have to sub that out to some company. I can rent an excavator and get all the cattails out, roots and all." He was a sketchy mechanic sort of character. Always had a MacGyver solution. Always was double-dipping with work equipment. I finally approved his scheme to rent a Mini X. Guess who gets a "Tim, I fucked up" FaceTime 15 minutes later? Me. I drive across the state to get on site and see he submerged the excavator in the pond and ran it so water sucked up the intake. We had to daisy chain 2 F-350s to the tow truck to tow the fucking thing 6 feet. He ended up buying it from the rental place and repairing it and flipping it. Story 9. When my younger brother fell through the ice while crossing a creek when we were kids, around 11 and 9, it was only slightly higher than knee-deep on us and slow-moving, so not a high risk of drowning. However, a very uncomfortable 1-2-mile walk back to the house in 45-degree F weather. I told him the ice was too thin to cross there, and we could cross maybe 300 upstream where it was ankle-deep water that was still frozen pretty solid, but I wasn't the boss of him. 4 steps later and he's up to his armpits because he landed on his butt on the creek bed. What made it better was the entire whining walk home. He thought he would be in big trouble with my mom. However, one look at the waddling, pitiful mess, and Mom broke out in laughter as she helped him out of the clothes. It gets funnier. He was mad that she wasn't mad and was shouting about how it's not funny and why isn't he in trouble? Isn't he grounded or something? Which leads to Mom running out of breath because she's laughing so hard now. He ends up storming to his room without being sent there. Story 10. I started following when COVID started up in China. It was various stories coming out in bits and pieces, but if you were paying attention, then you knew something bad was up. This was early to mid-January. I started telling friends and family about it and saying they needed to start paying attention. They mostly thought I was being dramatic. Then when Italy shut down, they all started to notice. Story 11. When I lived in New Orleans, I knew this insufferably pretentious goth chick from Ohio or someplace who was absolutely incapable of admitting she wasn't omniscient. She was fixing herself lunch and started blanketing it with cayenne pepper, and I warned her to watch out since it really is spicy. She rolled her eyes at me, added a bunch more, took one bite, ran into the bathroom to barf, and didn't talk to anyone for like 2 days. Story 12. Told my partner that I neither liked nor trusted a friend/colleague of his, and gave a detailed list of things that said friend had said or did that rang my alarm bells regarding this guy's arrogance and trustworthiness. Partner brushed it off, saying I'm too sensitive and slightly biased. First chance this guy got, he inflated his abilities and experience in a way that caused an internal company crisis and could get him fired. My partner had a quiet word with him to try to warn him he was making a huge mistake, and in return got belittled and gaslit in a lengthy blame-shifting message that ended with a jaunty, "Let's agree to disagree. When are we going for beers?" The icing on the cake was when said ex-friend called him too sensitive and slightly biased. The best part for me was I didn't have to say "I told you so," because my partner was stomping around going, "What an absolute cunt. You were right. You were right all along, and I should have listened to you." Story 13. This one happened recently. My dog has been chewing through his leash, and it was on the literal edge of breaking. I told my mom not to use that leash, even though it's retractable, because it's gonna break. I've been using the short, thick leash, not retractable, because it's harder for the dog to chew through. My mom used the leash, and guess what happened? It snapped. My mom had to close the gate once he got to the backyard. They were at the front, and I had to go outside in my fluffy pajamas to catch the dog. It rained outside recently, so the place was wet. Luckily, he didn't run out into the street, and it was at night. Story 14. One time, when my kids were little, I took them apple picking and then stopped at the supermarket with them to pick up a few things. My daughter was still working on an apple when we got in line to pay. A woman behind me said, "I hope she's enjoying that apple because all of us other customers are paying for it." I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "When you steal, the rest of us are paying for it." I told her that we'd just come from apple picking, and she made a face indicating that I was full of it. I paid, went out to my car, and got the kids buckled in. As I was loading the groceries in the trunk, this same woman came out. She was parked right next to us. I pulled the bag of apples out of the trunk to show her and said, "Here you go. I want you to appreciate what an ass you just made of yourself." Story 15. I don't know about my best, but here is one most of us can relate to right now. I predicted that the company I work for would start laying off people because they are too brazen and borrow a ton of money to grow the company. The company is totally fucked, Elmau. They have a stupid, unreasonable target, unhappy, talented employees, and they are going to get burned so bad unless they sell the company to another fish. Not even kidding, if like 2 people quit, the whole company will have a domino effect of burnout and collapse. I wouldn't be shocked if it only took one. Fuck investment firms. They take good businesses and fuck them over to make a profit at the expense of everyone else involved. No morality, no empathy. This is why employees need to stick together. We make the company, not them. They will lay off their best employees to save money, only to find out the hard way that they made them the fucking money to begin with. Discuss your salary. Set boundaries together. Loyalty goes both ways. If they are kicking out people and not rewarding their most loyal, then they don't deserve loyalty from you. Period. It really sucks when you like working for a company and slowly see it become everything it said it wouldn't be when you joined. Story 16. When my dad was at my first place for the first time, he was busy doing things and took off his outer layer. When he came in, I asked him if he wanted his hoodie, but he declined and sat down. Not 10 minutes later, he complained that he was cold and told me to turn the heat up. I was laughing so hard I could barely get the words out, but I told him to put his sweatshirt back on. That was very satisfying. Story 17. My boss didn't believe me that someone on my team was charging hours. He wasn't actually working in the time right after COVID peaked and things shifted to WFH. She accused me of micromanaging, and I just needed to trust him. So I did, while monitoring how often he was logging in to work. When she realized he was working at most 4 hours a week and taking over a month to implement a one-line code change, they finally acknowledged I was right and took action. Story 18. Teacher here. Had district personnel doing walk thoughts in my room looking for student collaboration. One boy sits alone. They were upset he wasn't sitting with a group. I told them, he really can't, to which they said, I bet he can. I just looked at them and moved on. No more than 2 minutes later, we are working out problems and I go to check his. He made a computation mistake, so I said, student, go check your multiplication. You made a mistake with your second partial product. Kid looks at me, yells, bro, it ain't wrong, and proceeds to flip his chair. I looked at the visitors and just shrugged my shoulders. Yes, this child is receiving behavioral services, and it is recommended he sit away from peers due to outbursts. Story 19. Body shop manager was writing estimates on vehicles, ordering parts, and letting the customer take the vehicle to return at a later date. I don't like pre-ordering parts because there are too many risks. This went on for months while pre-ordered parts were piling up. I kept bringing it up to our GM and the body shop manager, telling him many of these parts had been sitting there so long they were beyond their return window. They didn't care, basically telling me not to worry about it. Flash forward a few more months, and the body shop manager quit. New body shop manager starts calling these customers to get them to come in. Many had their vehicles repaired elsewhere due to us never getting back with them. Some were involved in another wreck, totaling them. Some were traded in or sold. Body shop had to write off tens of thousands of dollars. Should have listened to me in the first place. Story 20. I partook in physics research during undergrad in the early 2010s, and we did a field trip to LIGO, a large-scale experiment for detecting gravitational waves, which had never been observed at that time. Afterwards, an arrogant classmate of mine wouldn't shut up about how the experiment was a waste of time and how it will never work. I would always pick fights with this guy because he was so condescending and would try putting everyone beneath him. So I started defending the experiment, saying how there are many scientists much more knowledgeable than him working on it. He started calling me stupid that I believed that they could ever detect such a thing. Well, when they finally detected gravitational waves in 2015 and won the Nobel Prize in Physics soon after, it felt really good saying, "I told you so," which only happened in my head because I hated that guy and would never actually reach out to him, lol. But fuck you, Jeff, you were wrong and I was right. Story 21. I had a coworker, we'll call her Tina, who proudly stated that she had been drug-free for 6 months, but her boyfriend, who lived in their car, was still using. She lived in an apartment by herself, but this guy had broken into her place several times looking for stuff to sell for drug money. Another coworker and her boyfriend had been hanging out with Tina. They grew close and offered to let her live with them. I told them that was a bad idea because she hadn't been clean that long, and if her BF was shady enough to break into her place, what would stop him from breaking into theirs? Their lease was up in just over a month, but they had a new place a couple towns over. They told Tina she could stay there by herself until the lease was up, and she'd have to move out by then. They came back to their old place a month later to see that Tina had gotten back with her ex, started using again, and had robbed them blind. Found all this out from another coworker, and when I asked why they were telling me and not our friends, their response was, they were too embarrassed to admit that you were right. Story 22. I worked for a company that took private school students hiking and adventuring for short 3-5-day experiences. We hired a guy that had extensive outdoor experience to join the team. From when he started, I got a vibe that this guy does whatever the hell he wants and all on his schedule, and that everyone else should consider themselves lucky that they get to work with him. I started to notice him cutting corners and doing a few things that I would consider unsafe, especially since we weren't just adventuring solo. We were doing this as our job with clients. I talked to the boss about this on several occasions, but he swept it under the rug and ignored me most times because it never eventuated to anything serious. After about a year of this, I couldn't stand it anymore and submitted an official complaint to the boss, outlining some serious safety concerns and how I had raised them before, but to no avail, and wanted my concerns on the record. As luck would have it, about 24 hours after I submitted my email, this guy blundered big time, hiked students into an area I had repeatedly told him they shouldn't go because of poor access in the event of an emergency, and took them swimming in a flowing river. This was not the first time he had done this. I later found out, but he had just been able to get away with it. However, this time the river was up and flowing more than usual. Half of the group was swept away in the river and were separated from him, fortunately. Nobody was seriously hurt. But one young lady was hurt enough that she required evacuation. This was made extremely difficult given the area they were in, and the fact that the group was separated by fast-flowing water. I later found out that the two halves of the group both thought that the other half had perished because many hours went by before the new guy was able to make contact with the half that wasn't swept away. Poor kids. I'm all for adventure, which is why I loved the job, but there were so many warning signs that he and my boss ignored.